NATO is a means to an end, and the same is true for NATO membership. In my view, the time for Ukraine to join NATO will be a time when that step will benefit both the security of Ukraine and the security of NATO. It's not axiomatic that that will be the consequence if Ukraine joins NATO just because we wanted to and just because someone says, yes, you can. My second initial point is this. As Ambassador Hub said this morning, Ukraine is not only an important state in Europe, it is a pivotal state in Europe. It was a former British Prime Minister who described Ukraine as the pivot of the future European security architecture. That was John Major in 1994. So it is a pivotal state. What I want to underscore here, remind you of, is that it is also a weak state, and not only a weak state, but a deeply flawed and internally misaligned state, in part because of the significant part, because of the culture of power inherited from the Soviet Union, but also the mutation of that culture of power that has arisen since then, which the current authorities have taken to new depths, and because across the political spectrum, most Ukrainian leaders and elites have served their own interests rather than the national interests of the country. And this is not a favourable starting point. One has to understand that is where we're starting from. This is a very hard truth, but if we do not understand hard truths and respect them, we will end up damaging Ukraine and its security and possibly its independence. Even during the Cold War, let's remind ourselves of what some of those conditions were in the Cold War. In Europe, resources spent on defense by today's standards were considerable. They were all focused on European security. Even then, it was understood, because there had been previous enlargements of NATO since 1949, that countries would not be suitable allies or properly protected by the institutions of collective security unless both their territorial and their political orders were defensible. And everyone understood that if Article 5 was not credible or effective in one place, it would undermine collective security overall. And that was then, when we had those resources and that focus was entirely on European security. That is not where we are now. We should... Let me move on, because I don't want to speak too long about this. One easily could. Let me now consider the issue before us directly. We've been asked to focus on what went wrong. But even before doing that, I have to remind you that even before the Orange Revolution, a lot in the Ukraine-NATO relationship went right. It was, after 1994, a very significant relationship for NATO. The UK-Ukraine bilateral defence programme was the largest bilateral defence programme we had for a number of years with a non-NATO state. And this relationship was even more significant for Ukraine. It was based on a judicious combination of firmness and an understanding of where the art of the possible was. And I would say there was more than one occasion where that connection and that relationship was instrumental to preserving Ukraine's independence. And it actually, in 1997, produced, for a time, a significant change in Russian policy and some significant concessions. And this was developing at a time when Ukraine's defense and security establishment, in large part, had no intentions of joining the alliance. In fact, many were entirely opposed to it because they felt it would be going too far with the capacity they then possessed. What they did appreciate, what they insisted upon, were two things. Everything NATO was doing to bring about defense and security reform in the country, which is all about capacity. We discussed some of it in the last session. But secondly, because in a variety of indirect ways, NATO was making it clear, in practice, there is a commitment. And that was underscored by at least one Secretary General when he discussed how Article 4 situations would be applied to Ukraine if it found itself threatened. What we have been dealing with since then, I think, is a combination of three factors. First, in this century, NATO has become more aware of some of its inherent limitations. When Vladimir Putin became president in Russia, one of the major shifts that emerged was not a shift in interests, it was a shift in method, from a focus on geopolitics to geoeconomics, with, of course, enormous reliance being placed on energy supply in that entire relationship. NATO can't help very much with that. There is a lot on the economic front. There are a whole range of economic vulnerabilities now which are a matter of strategic importance to Russia, about which NATO can do very little, and the EU, if it will, can and must do a great deal more. Secondly, after the Orange Revolution, there were certain expectations that were only partially met for a time and then not met at all. And let me put it in the following terms. We had, a few of us, possibly even one or two people present here now, had a small seminar with some of the leading foreign policy and security people in the Yushchenko administration. We were all asked at the end to go around the table and say, what should be Ukraine's greatest foreign policy priority? And the view I expressed, which I think was the view we all had, was success in internal policy. Changing these institutions of the country, overcoming the Soviet legacy. In NATO terms, building capacity to be able to defend yourself. And in security terms, and Valentin could talk at considerable length about this, a lot of it, it's the term transparency, which we tend to like for a whole range of reasons, is directly relevant to security, because what it means is acquiring the capacity to know who makes decisions, where they make decisions, what decisions they're actually making, and why. Who is really operating in Crimea? If there is unrest between Crimean Tatars and somebody else, did it arise spontaneously? You have to ask the same question if depots of conventional munitions suddenly blow up. Did that just happen? Was somebody stupid, or did somebody plan it? All of this requires an immense amount of knowledge, very reliable institutional machinery, even in the security domain. Only Anatoly Grishchenko, in the Minister of Defense, was addressing these issues systematically, and because he was addressing them too systematically, Yushchenko himself removed him. And yet at the same time, Yushchenko was devoting all of his efforts on the NATO question, which had two other harmful effects. It took away a lot of talent and brain power from addressing these fundamental issues because NATO had such a priority. It was needlessly polarizing what remained and what has always been a very divided society, and it was deepening divisions inside NATO itself. It was a wrong priority and the wrong sequence. And the third thing, of course, is everything which has happened since the events of 9/11. The so-called globalization of NATO policy. The most dramatic example of it being, most telling example of it being what happened in 2008 in Georgia. That those people who understood what the dynamics were and were predicting for months that this was almost bound to happen. It was very difficult getting access to the highest level. There was no high-level coordination about any of this. And at the time the conflict broke out, the best of Georgia's 4 brigades was deployed in Iraq. The entire US military mission in Georgia was not training the Georgian armed forces for territorial defense, but for doing something else, to become widgets in NATO's great machine, which was increasingly preoccupied with global issues. And at this very time when we're distracted, where also resources are contracting, where attention is shifted from Europe, we then decide that this is the time to advance the case for a membership action plan for NATO in Georgia. And how does Moscow view it? As a bluff, quite rightly. And they called it, and we could do nothing. Nothing at a cost that would be considered bearable and reasonable and safe. And these are very sorry realities, which are not inevitable, but they are there. Now, last point, and I will conclude. Walter has asked us to address the issue of paradigm shift, and I'm sorry our MFA colleague Alexander is no longer with us. Of course there has been a paradigm shift in Ukraine. Ukraine never had a non-bloc policy. Non-bloc status today is a legal and constitutional reality. It's a profound change. If time permitted, I think it would be useful to point out that this non-bloc status neither conforms to what we normally understand as neutrality, which is an internationally guaranteed, legally sanctioned arrangement, or non-alignment, which is what Sweden and Yugoslavia had in the Cold War rather than neutrality, which demands a very robust defense capability. It's neither the one thing nor the other. It has been given no practical intellectual substance or substantiation. Anatoly Grichenko now calls the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine the Ministry for the Disposal of Surplus Property, to friends, of course, at markdown rates. There's no strategy supporting this. There has been no effort to focus on Ukraine's critical security vulnerabilities, which are becoming more and more flagrant, in which many of which have been deepened with the unwitting help, at least, of the current authorities in power, who haven't seemed to come across the axiom that was expressed very tersely by a former KGB resident in Tokyo who defected to the United States, and what he said was the following: look for your vulnerabilities and there you will find the KGB. The vulnerabilities are there, and Ukraine, even less than in 2004, 5, 6, is in a position to know who is exploiting them and who is there and taking advantage of them. But as a matter of principle, a country dealing with a neighbor that regards its own independence as an historical aberration and something to be either limited or reversed, should never, as a matter of principle, state what it will or will not do, will rule out a course of action. And to unilaterally take the issue of joining NATO off the table and give it legal sanction is a position that I do not think is intellectually sustainable at all. There has been a paradigm shift, but I want to underscore the other. The biggest paradigm shift has been NATO's paradigm shift. We are seeing it in Chicago now. It has been referred to several times. If one looks at the agenda of the summit. And the question that is not going to be raised in that summit, I don't think it will be, but which must be raised today is this: does NATO wish to remain relevant to European security? I, unfortunately, don't know the answer to that question. Thank you very much.